How do we speak a hospitable word in worship? The answer depends in part on the word. The answer depends in part on the worship. So when I preach two sermons in the same place, when I preach the same sermon in two places, I need to change some words that the congregation I preach to on Sunday finds hospitable if I'm going to speak a hospitable word in worship at my seminary on Wednesday. Regardless of what the author of John's Gospel intended, the words slave and free sound different in worship in suburban Chicago from the way they sound in worship on the south side of Chicago. And the words slave and free sound different in worship in Richmond, Virginia, from the way they sound anywhere in Chicago. So if we are going to speak a hospitable word in worship, a worship that says something truthful and meaningful about God, God's will for the world, and our place in it, and makes people feel welcome and comfortable and like they belong. If we're going to speak a hospitable word in worship, we need to get particular. We need to be specific. We need to start small. How do we speak a hospitable word, say, in academy worship? Our president entrusted me with two tasks for this meeting, in addition to giving this talk. Both concern speaking a hospitable word in academy worship. And so I put together a table prayer for the Sunday's Baraka breakfast, and I prepared the closing liturgy. Say grace and lead ascending right. No big deal. And yet, with every word I wrote, I found myself second guessing as I kept asking myself the same question. Whom will I offend? We of the North American Academy of Liturgy, we know the power of words. And so we are attentive to words. We are particular about words. We are easily offended by words, especially words spoken in worship. It seems we've always been this way. In the spirit of Max Johnson, who reminds us that experience must be grounded in a rite's history and evolution, and as part of preparing for next year's annual meeting in Albuquerque, I spent an afternoon in Ed Foley's archives, looking back at NAAL's last meeting in Albuquerque 19 years ago. I found some old friends lurking there, questions and opinions concerning words spoken in academy worship that I have heard bandied about this academy. Like, one, whether the language of academy liturgy should reflect accepted practice or push an envelope. Two, how we ought and ought not name God. And three, should the language of a given academy liturgy be guided by syncretism or a particular faith tradition? As a Christian preacher and teacher of Christian preaching, I counsel students that if they do not do what Paul says and proclaim Christ crucified, they haven't preached. And yet I came away from the archives wondering whether it's ever appropriate to name Jesus in academy liturgies. And if so, how to do that without giving offense. You see, one of the things I came to appreciate this year, serving on the Academy Committee, is that the people you honor, the last thing the people you honor by electing them to host an annual meeting want to do is to offend you. And so they are very careful to speak a hospitable word in worship. Unless you think that I am only talking about an intra-academy issue and not something central to the study of liturgy, the time that I spend with worship planners and worship leaders leads me to conclude that negotiating the tension between hospitality, making people feel welcome and comfortable and like they belong, and word or proclamation, saying something truthful and meaningful about God, God's will for the world, and our place in it, is at the heart of every assembly's worship today. Lean too far one way and you offend and exclude. Lean too far the other way and you find yourself worshiping a watered-down, lowest common denominator deity that really doesn't stand for or against anything. How do we speak a hospitable word in worship is a question that worship planners and worship leaders are asking. So perhaps an academy dedicated to extending the benefits of liturgical scholarship to worshiping communities would do well to reflect on how we speak a word in worship that is both welcoming and true. And in fact, we do. For those who desire that the vice presidential address be a purely scholarly paper, this would be the review of the literature section. I would recite a litany of important books and articles and academy papers on language in liturgy. I assign my preaching students Ruth Duck's Finding Words for Worship, so I know at least one. Yes, if this were a purely scholarly paper, I would review the liturgy aloud, and some of you could listen closely to make sure that I mention your names. But this is an address, a spoken rather than a written word, and reciting the literature feels to me a bit like giving a eulogy. Not that the issue is dead, rather reviewing the literature aloud is like telling people about a life they lived and loved and served and shared and have been part of longer than me. For while I have devoted the last quarter century to reflecting on the language of disability in worship, I was not in Albuquerque in 1993 when the feminist liturgy group led worship that's described for posterity as inviting, moving, wonderful, powerful, and raising questions of appropriateness. But some of you were there. At this meeting, I will not sit in on the liturgical language seminar, which will, among other things, help us to find language with which to confess mortality, injustice, disease, and meaninglessness, as well as sin. Some of you will. So rather than reviewing the literature, I thank you that in seminar and liturgy, in scholarship and practice, examining the tension in public worship between hospitality, making people feel welcome and comfortable like they belong, and word or proclamation, saying something truthful and meaningful about God, God's will for the world, and our place in it, is not new to this academy. It is certainly not new to those who have taken a turn planning and leading academy worship. But all of us have come away from Academy liturgies knowing deep in our bones that the words spoken in worship are powerful. The words spoken in worship are powerful. And Academy Liturgy does a wonderful job of bringing home the reason that fussing with the words in any liturgy is akin to playing with dynamite. For we dare to believe that the words uttered in worship are divine as well as human speech, and somehow possess the power of God. All three Abrahamic traditions agree that ours is a God of powerful words. The Torah tells us that in the beginning, God said, "Let there be," and there was. God bound God's self by a word to Noah. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the whole earth. God spoke words of promise to make great nations of both Hagar's and Sarah's sons. God spoke a word of command to Moses. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And God made a way where there was none. And God wrote 10 words on 2 stone tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. In the New Testament, the Gospel of John identifies Jesus saying, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth." Intersecting the plane of human existence and the transcendent Word of God, the power of Quran is reflected in one ayah or verse that says, "Had we bestowed this Quran on a mountain, you would see the mountain humbling itself, breaking asunder for awe of God." Yes, all three Abrahamic traditions agree that ours is a God of powerful words, powerful enough to form the world and us. And all three Abrahamic traditions celebrate God's powerful word in worship. The ceremonies of the Torah service of Shabbat honor the Torah as the manifestation of the presence of the Holy One, the shape of the divine. Yes, even as it were the body of God. Thank you, Larry Hoffman, for those words. Speaking from my own Christian tradition, Luther calls preaching the Viva Vox Christi and the Viva Vox Evangelii, the living voice of Christ and the living voice of the gospel. Ambrose, the 4th century bishop of Milan, who finds a quote in every address I give, declared of the Eucharist, "The word of Christ consecrates this sacrament." And one Muslim scholar says that reciting the Quran is more than prayer and an act of virtue. Reciting the Quran is a source of God's healing, mercy, comfort, and protection. As one who cannot ordinarily read words when leading worship, but must commit them to memory, I truly resonate with Islam's understanding of reciting words in worship, though I express it in biblical terms. Speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, God declared, "I will write my law on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Over the years, God has written both law and gospel on my heart as I have memorized the words of the liturgy. And so even when I support a change in liturgical language, Whenever my denomination and its publishing house fuss with the words in worship, frequently changing them just enough to make them different, I experience the change as its own sort of heart surgery. So I am grateful to congregations that still invite me to intone, "It is indeed right and salutary." And I am empathetic to friends who find themselves tongue-tied by simple phrases like, "And with your spirit, that I have greatly sinned," and consubstantial with the Father. You see, regardless of what we think of changes in liturgical language, they mess with our hearts. Sometimes we feel embraced. Sometimes we feel offended. And sometimes the very words that embrace us offend someone sitting nearby. Things get even more complicated when the worshiping community is an ecumenical and interfaith academy of liturgical scholars who gather once a year to at best secondarily worship. For the Academy seminars are the heart of our annual meeting. Assemblies of a single faith tradition that worship together more regularly can better discover, negotiate, and determine what language does and does not work in that context. So, for example, when the congregation where until recently I served as consulting pastor wanted to become a field education site, my pastoral colleague and I explained that if we want to train the church's pastors, we need to use the church's worship book. And so Lutheran Book of Worship gave way to Evangelical Lutheran Worship. For a long time, the congregation hated the new hymnal. And when one of their pastors had even a small hand in creating the new book, parishioners can express their disdain up close and personal. So eventually, at an adult forum, we asked, "Why don't you like the new book?" Those present were univocal in their response. "Blessed be the Holy Trinity, one God, who forgives all our sins, whose mercy endures forever." The problem was not so much the language. They didn't know when to make the sign of the cross. Or more precisely, making the sign of the cross didn't feel right. So we agreed not to exercise that option. Expansive language flourishes elsewhere in worship. Complaints about the new hymnal have ceased. And every service begins in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Conversations about the language in our worship continue in our academy. I learned this year how very seriously the Academy Committee takes the evaluations we fill out after each annual meeting. Yet, despite the Academy Committee's best efforts, our liturgies are too few and far between, with different leadership and a different location each year, for us to truly discover, negotiate, and determine what language does and does not work for us. So what do? We could use Academy liturgies to come up with a set of rules of etiquette that govern the language in worship to help those who plan and lead to be better hosts. We could, for example, agree to eliminate, 1, all economic, militaristic, and hierarchical language from Academy liturgies. We might, 2, embrace language that is expansive without being fleeting, drawn from sacred texts, but varied in our usage. We might, 3, commit to balancing language that is known by heart and easily repeatable, and language that relies on printed or projected worship materials. Yes, we could use academy liturgies to come up with rules of etiquette, to test them for speaking a hospitable word in worship. After all, emphasizing hospitality makes sense because it's something we all share in common. For centuries, all three Abrahamic traditions have considered the account of Abraham and Sarah welcoming the three visitors, and preparing and serving them a sumptuous meal as a model of hospitality. From Abraham and Sarah, we learn to seek out opportunities to welcome guests, to be sensitive to the needs of our guests, and to not to do anything to cause embarrassment or discomfort to our guests. Perhaps most helpful, the Talmud teaches, "It is written, I will fetch a morsel of bread." It is also written, "And Abraham ran to the herd." Rabbi Eliezer said, "This teaches that the righteous promise little but perform much, whereas the wicked promise much and do not perform even little." The Quran emphasizes that as soon as Abraham saw the three visitors, the three messengers coming, he brought them a roasted calf without delay. Scholars interpret this act as exemplary, saying that it symbolizes Abraham's exceedingly high morality and therefore provides a model of how men should act in a similar situation. In the New Testament, the epistle to the Hebrews seems to allude to the grace and blessing that Abraham and Sarah received through hospitality. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. So coming up with rules of etiquette for being better hosts makes sense, until you try it. A few years ago, some professors in Chicago formulated some rules of etiquette to help those who plan and lead the annual worship life of the Ecumenical Acts Doctor of Ministry and Preaching program, where I serve as dean, to be more hospitable in the language they choose and speak. Limit masculine pronouns for God was one of the things we directed, to the praise of the program's faculty and leadership. Then some students complained that the program was being racist because calling God Father is essential to African American worship. Younger women, including my daughter, looked at me blankly and said we were being patriarchal. Who are you to tell us how we can and cannot name God? As only a daughter can, Chelsea regularly chides me for avoiding masculine pronouns for God in my preaching and writing, reminding me that the Bible calls God Father, that Jesus was a man, and that the world has more pressing concerns. I find that once they are away from my seminary, younger women from whom I genuinely receive the gospel also refer to God as He. One former student even submitted an article to the journal I edit with a note warning me not to change the masculine pronouns and fuss with the way she names God. Something similar happened when the adult Sunday school class in an African American congregation read an article that I'd written which begins, "I shudder when someone reminds me that people with dark skin find it painful to hear that God is light, and in God there is no darkness at all. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. I received a lovely pastoral letter from a lady writing on behalf of the class who wanted me to know that people of color understand metaphor. That they are not offended by the language, and so I need to not worry myself. And people like me who live with a disability, we do not agree that we are handicapped, disabled, differently abled, or definitely abled. Personally, I prefer descriptive language. I am legally blind. Jen, can you get the sentence?
So how do we arrive?
At a set of rules of etiquette for speaking a hospitable word in worship? Even if we could, the result would be that we place the responsibility for speaking a word in worship that is true and meaningful about God, God's will for the world, and our place in it, and that makes people feel welcome and comfortable and like they belong, solely and squarely on the shoulders of those who plan and lead worship. The rest of us could sit back, fold our arms, and wait to see whether we feel embraced or offended. Speaking a hospitable word in worship, negotiating the tension between hospitality and proclamation, becomes the sole responsibility of the host. And therein lies the problem. The host cannot do it all. For a while, by welcoming strangers, we may be entertaining angels unaware. Most often, we are not. Have you ever been to a dinner party where somebody at the table is simply a lousy guest? I once attended a dinner party where one of the guests spent the entire evening commenting and complaining about the way the couple giving the dinner divided up their hosting duties. At another dinner party, a guest arrived late, refused to eat what was served, and loudly dominated the table. No matter what the host tried to do, including quickly preparing another dinner for this guest, the evening was ruined. Tension filled the room as joy departed. The other guests grew quiet, and we quickly marched on to dessert and coffee so that everyone could be on their way. Contrast that with a dinner where the guests know how to be good guests. They are glad to be there. They are eager to try what is being served. They look for something to appreciate, and they find a way to appreciate it. A thumbs up toward the kitchen or a request for just one more bite of cheese can make the night. A chef once told me that his vocation is to give people joy. No matter how technically perfect a meal is, if the guests are not enjoying themselves, the chef has failed at his job. This means the chef, the host, and the liturgist only have so much control. I contend that it is only possible to speak a hospitable word in worship when those who receive it are good guests. The problem is that many of us worship in communities where we belong. We have so devoted our lives to the liturgy that we know how it should be done. So rather than showing up as invited guests at a dinner party, We arrive as food critics at a restaurant. We know what we're looking for, and we're looking to find it. And when we don't find it, when the words spoken in worship are not what we need, or what we expect, or what we think should be spoken, when the words spoken in worship do not speak to us or do not speak for us, we feel uncomfortable. We feel disconnected. We feel discounted. We feel that the words spoken in worship are inhospitable, and we find ourselves offended. At least that's what happens to me in worship. When the word blind is used for negative behaviors, characteristics, and situations, especially in worship where one must be able to physically see to participate. The appointed lectionary reading was John's account of the man born blind. For me, a very real person, whom the preacher quickly allegorized away into a character representing all of us. Blind to true love and to true relationship. Blind to deep care from another human being. Blind to the demands of justice and equality. Blind to the wide distribution of wealth between the rich and the poor. Blind to anyone and anything outside the interests of our own little group. But mostly blind to our own failings and shortcomings. The message of that sermon was clear. Blind is bad. And this from a reading where the man born blind is the hero? And this in a community where I belong? I cringed just now as I recited those words from that sermon to you. I certainly cringed when I heard those words in worship. Then we celebrated the Eucharist using an incarnation of the liturgy that is used at St. Gregory of Nyssa Episcopal Church in San Francisco. We all gathered around the table singing "Open My Eyes." It was crowded and chaotic, and as a man born blind, I needed to be led around. Yuck. And while being led around the worship space, a bunch of sighted people singing "Open My Eyes" added insult to injury. The ministers passed through the crowds with the bread and cup, everyone reaching out to receive them. But as a man born blind, I couldn't tell when Jesus was passing by or where to reach. Then, with the cantor calling us to watch him, to do what he did, and not to be one of the frozen chosen, the assembly danced its way out of worship. But as a man born blind, I couldn't see the cantor or the other people dancing, and I was, in fact, frozen. In that moment, it occurred to me, if this was the way our church really worshiped, I would have a really hard time receiving communion. I wouldn't be able to distribute the sacrament, so I couldn't be ordained. Mostly, I'd feel bad about being blind. Something I don't generally feel. In that moment, the pericope came to life as I, the man born blind, felt, maybe even was, excluded from the faith community. Standing there, frozen, my friend Barbara said something. At first I didn't hear the words, but as they sank in, I admitted to myself, as much as I wanted to belong here, this worship experience didn't speak to me. It certainly didn't speak for me. I could stand there and fume, or I could decide that I didn't have to belong here. I could be a guest. And in that moment of recognizing that my role in this worship experience was to be a liturgical guest, I experienced shalom, grace, Brahma. So if I was going to be a liturgical guest, I was going to be a good liturgical guest. I stopped resenting that I needed to be led around and helped to receive communion. This community didn't get it, or they didn't think of it, or they didn't care about it, or they were trying to communicate and accomplish something else. When I went looking for what that something else might be, I realized that the sermon was powerful for others who genuinely found the liturgy joyous and enjoyable. And I found something I could appreciate. I was truly grateful that my friend Barbara was standing next to me. She had patted my hand throughout the liturgy, making corrective comments during all the blind talk of the sermon. She kept me from tripping and falling as we made our way to the table, and she stopped traffic to make sure I received the sacrament. Mostly, Barbara felt uncomfortable with me. And in that moment, as the assembly started to dance, Barbara spoke words that unfroze me. "We don't have to stay," Barbara said. And then, "It's time for us to go." And together, we walked out of worship. Because I had decided to be a liturgical guest, I was able to receive Barbara's hospitable words, which spoke truth and meaning about God, God's will for the world, and my place in it. In essence, Barbara said, God doesn't expect you to put up with this. If I hadn't decided to be a guest, I suspect I'd still be fuming and wouldn't have heard the words. It is only possible to speak a hospitable word in worship when those who will receive it are good guests. So maybe our task is not only to teach liturgical hosts how to speak a hospitable word, but also to teach liturgical guests how to receive a hospitable word. And maybe Academy Liturgy is a good place to start, as we who are so often hosts give up that role, even surrender our sense of belonging, and regard ourselves instead as guests of the divine and the assembly. Then, once we figure out how to be good liturgical guests here, we can go home and teach, better yet, model good liturgical guesting in the worshiping communities where we live and serve and worship and belong. So what are some rules of etiquette for good liturgical guesting? Since my goal is to receive and speak a hospitable word in worship, maybe it is good for us to look at some words we deem sacred. The Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. When I looked, I found 6 rules of etiquette for good liturgical guesting that I would quickly like to share with you. First, let God have the last word. We begin where liturgy often ends, with evaluation. Particularly evaluation about our differences. My colleague Mark Swanson, who teaches interfaith relations, pointed me to one of the verses of tolerance in the Quran that speaks of the God-willed character of human diversity. It goes something like this. If God had willed, he could have made you a single community. But God has willed to test you by what he has given you. Therefore, compete with one another in doing good. You will all return to God, who will give you to know about the things in which you differed. From this perspective, liturgical guests do not evaluate worship by their own standards. They embrace other criteria. According to Dr. Swanson, those who have listened to this verse, both inside and outside the Muslim community, have been led to ponder the deep mystery of the one human family. Our God-willed diversity. What it means that God has tested us by what God has given us. And if there is to be competition, then it be competition in goodness. And the reality of our return to God, who alone holds the last word, which means we can leave the last word about our differences to God. As I contemplate the human task of coming to know one another, I'm led to contemporary homiletic theory, which understands the sermon as testimony rather than teaching, as proposal rather than pronouncement, as conversation starter rather than conversation stopper, as first word rather than last word. Contemplating our God-willed diversity leads me to distinguish between essential words and words that are not. And reflecting on the reality of our return to God during the Christian season of Advent cautions me that waiting till the end when God reveals all things is not a passive process. And competing in doing good is not polite acceptance. Sometimes we simply must, gently but honestly, speak our concerns and oppositions, especially when the words spoken in worship harm others. But trusting God to have the last word makes me a better guest, because it checks my need to fix, correct, and have the last word on every word right now. Second, take a little, give a lot. Closely related to evaluation is benefit. What did you get out of worship? The Talmud teaches us to take a little and to give a lot. Those who want to benefit from their hosts, the Talmud instructs, should do so as Elisha the prophet did. The Talmud describes a certain woman who urged Elisha the prophet, not knowing at the time that he was a prophet, to accept her hospitality. Elisha agreed to eat only bread. And from then on, the prophet would stop into his host's home whenever he was passing by. In time, the woman told her husband that this seemed to be a holy man, and that they should prepare a special room for him to use when he's on his journeys, in which they put a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. Later, Elisha learned that the couple had no children, and in appreciation for their hospitality, he blessed them, and after many years of barrenness, they had a son. Elisha took a special interest in the boy, and when he suddenly died, Elisha made a special trip to their home and miraculously brought the boy back to life. The Talmud infers that the woman had to press Elisha to receive her hospitality, and even then, he only agreed to eat bread. The fact that they gave him only a small room sparsely furnished suggests that they knew that this was all he would accept, and to give him more would make him uncomfortable. On the other hand, though Elisha only took a little, he gave a lot. Not only affecting the couple having a child, but saving the boy's life. The Talmud then teaches that those who benefit from their hosts do so only sparingly. They avoid saying anything and doing anything that will make their hosts go out of the way for them. In fact, they do everything they can to lessen the burden of hosting them. And they give a lot. For liturgical guests, this means that we go to worship not expecting to get all our needs met, but to take a little, to give a lot. Third, wear your wedding robe. Let's talk about attitude. People passionate about Christian evangelism like to point to Jesus' parable, which compares the kingdom of heaven and a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. When the invited guests refused to come, the king sent out servants who gathered all that they found, both good and bad, so that the wedding hall was filled with guests. Those who advocate for Christian evangelism want this wedding banquet to be the model that those who plan and lead worship use as hosts, particularly when it comes to the Eucharist and welcoming people at the table. But then the story turns from hosting to guesting. But when the king went in to see the wedding guests, he saw a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" But the man was speechless. The king said to his attendants, "Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So if the wedding banquet is the model of worship, what does it mean for worshipers, guests, to show up with or without a wedding robe? Perhaps it has something to do with the attitude we bring to worship. Grateful to be there. Eager to share the king's joy. Glad to enter into the celebration. Expecting God to say or do something, or not. Maybe wearing a wedding robe means that we remain attentive, even anticipant, worshiping with heart and body as well as with mind and voice, and asking not, what did I get out of worship, but what is God saying and doing? My friend Mary Catherine Hilkert, who teaches theology at the University of Notre Dame, describes the task as naming grace from the depths of human experience. Fourth, let's talk about location. Where we sit in worship affects our relationship with the community, the liturgy, and the sermon. In the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke tells us to take the lowest place. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not take the place of honor, but go and sit in the lowest place. While Luke is giving a strategy for being exalted rather than humbled, this reminds us that liturgical guests enter into worship with humility. We check our egos and our expertise at the door. Whenever I go to worship, I do my best to leave the sermon critic behind and to cultivate my hunger for God's hospitable and life-giving word. I confess that sometimes this is a spiritual discipline. That's a pious way of saying it's hard. Fifth, eat and drink what is provided. Two of the Gospels report that Jesus sent out disciples to proclaim the kingdom with instructions on how to be good guests. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking what is provided. Do not move about from house to house. Remaining in the same house and not moving about from house to house says that liturgical guests invest their time. They give the liturgy a chance. Eating and drinking what is provided means that liturgical guests seek to be nourished by what is served, by what is provided, rather than going hungry because of what it's not. And liturgical guests distinguish between words they find distasteful and words to which they are allergic, and words that may be tainted, and words that are definitely poisonous. They distinguish and respond differently. But I am struck most by the sixth rule of etiquette, again from the New Testament. Whenever you enter a house, first say, "Peace to this house." First say, "Peace." Now there is a hospitable word that speaks truth and meaning about God, God's will for the world, and our place in it. Peace. If we follow this rule of etiquette, we have a liturgical guest bringing a hospitable word to a liturgical host. As in the Abraham and Sarah story, the guests are the ones sent by God. Writing of similar reversal dynamics in Jesus' sending of the 70 to proclaim the reign of God, Jennifer Lord writes, "We are sent with words of peace and a declaration of the kingdom, and told this will be sufficient." Liturgical guests bringing a hospitable word to a liturgical host. It's counterintuitive. It's juxtaposition. It's liturgy. God doing the world the way the world was meant to be done. For from God's perspective, when a host fails to speak a hospitable word, a guest makes certain one is heard. In worship, when a liturgical host fails to speak a hospitable word, a liturgical guest makes certain one is received. Maybe we of the North American Academy of Liturgy could study this practice and extend any benefits we discover to worshiping communities. Peace be to this house. I don't know how it is for you, but people notice what kind of guest I am in worship. My students tell me that when I forget myself, they don't have to ask me what I think of a sermon, particularly when I don't like it. Apparently, when the head goes down, the sermon is in trouble. When the glasses come off, the preacher should sit down. Once during worship, we had a creative Eucharistic prayer which eliminated the institution narrative, a deal breaker for Lutherans. I could feel every eye on the place watching me to see how I would respond, particularly whether I would or would not go to communion. People notice the kind of guests we are in worship. So maybe we of the North American Academy of Liturgy could use academy liturgies to try out liturgical guesting. And when we get the rules of etiquette down, take them home and share them, better yet, embody them in the worshiping communities where we live and serve and worship and belong. With so many word changes in worship today, perhaps we liturgists could be the one to make certain that people receive a hospitable word in worship by speaking and embodying it through good liturgical guesting. Thank you for your kind attention.